technology. Okay, so why do we do scientific writing, and what should scientific writing look like? Scientific writing is different than creative writing, right? When you're doing scientific writing, the main purpose is we need to be clear, we need to be concise. The purpose of scientific writing is to communicate our new scientific findings to the world, right? And we don't want people to have to guess about what our findings were. We don't want them to have to guess about what our methods were. So if we say that we put the culture into a beacon, the beacon is not symbolic for life or something like that, right? No, we literally put the culture into the beacon. We're very clear and precise in our communication and technical writing and scientific writing. In scientific writing, we write to communicate, we don't write to impress. So when you're thinking about, oh, how should I say this? When you're thinking about big words and using thesaurus to think about some clever word that maybe no one knows about. No, we want to be clear, and simple words are fine whenever we're doing scientific writing. In fact, you have permission to use simple words whenever you're doing scientific writing. When you think about scientific writing and our sentence patterns, should we use a lot of complex sentences, again, big complicated words? Probably not in our scientific writing. So I love this little scientific article grid. So if the subject matter that we're trying to communicate to our audience is complex and our average sentence is easy to understand, that is great scientific writing, right? This is a complicated topic, but I'm writing it in such a way that any person can pick up my paper and understand what I did, what my purpose was, what my results were. That is great writing, right? If our subject matter is simple and our average sentence is easy to understand, that's just good old honest writing, right? That's good, honest, technical writing. If our subject matter is complex and our average sentence is hard to understand, then that's typical writing, right? I mean, sometimes we've all probably picked up a manuscript and gone like, I don't really have a good background in this topic, and I certainly don't understand anything that this person's writing about because they use so many acronyms, so much jargon. I don't know what these things are that they're talking about, right? That's kind of typically how we write. And then if our subject matter is simple and our average sentences are hard to understand, that's probably trying to BS something, right? Like something wasn't really all that complicated or significant. We're trying to make it seem like it is that way. So something that I developed over the course of teaching technical writing, I've taught it now for 5 years, is this anatomy of a scientific paper, because I really think it helped people to sort of envision, so, what should my paper look like, right? So the introduction, the way that we start, we should think of it like an upside down triangle or a funnel, right? We want to start with some big opening statement. Why is my study important, right? What is the significance of my study? What are the gaps in knowledge? Those sort of things. But we need this big opening statement to tell the reader, hey, this is important. So an area of research that I've published in quite a bit is HIV. And so I think maybe all of my papers start with, globally, 37 million people are infected with HIV. Hey, this is an important problem, right? So start with that. And then we want to funnel down to the purpose of our study, the purpose of our paper. I'll talk about how to do this funneling process in the introduction, but we get down to that purpose. Then we write the methods. What did we do? Step by step. What did we do? Then we write the results. What did we find? No interpretation, just the facts. What did we find, right? And then we write our discussion. And our discussion is a right side up triangle. So it starts with the most important findings of our study, and then it funnels down to our big closing statement. Okay, so how could our research be applied, or what is the significance of our research? The great thing about technical writing, it is free. The great thing about technical writing is we can start anywhere in this process, right? I think a lot of us think, oh, okay, I'm gonna sit down on my computer and start with my big statement, right? You don't have to start there, right? If you're in the middle of doing your study, do your methods. Write exactly what you're doing throughout it. If you're in the middle of analyzing your data and coming up with results, write your results. You don't always have to start at the introduction and then go to the methods and then go to results and then go to the discussion. In fact, sometimes it's better if you have your purpose statement, if you have your research questions, of course, that's what's guiding, right, your methods and your data analysis. If you have those, go ahead and skip to the methods and then do the results, because your introduction and discussion, they need to work together. And sometimes it's easier to write the introduction and the discussion in tandem rather than write the introduction, find out your results, start working on your discussion and go, oh shoot, I never mentioned this in my introduction, anything about what I want to talk about in my discussion. So I have to go back and at least introduce that topic in my introduction. So the anatomy of our manuscript. So as far as the introduction, we need to provide significant background in order for the reader to evaluate our study, right? So we need to say, what is the rationale for our study? Why did we choose our topic? Why is this topic important, right? And then we need to clearly say what the purpose or the objective of our study is. And again, we're going to start broad and we're going to narrow down to that purpose statement. So a way to think of this, and I'm happy to share my PowerPoints with you all so you don't feel like you have to frantically write stuff down. So again, we want to have that big opening statement that talks about the magnitude of the problem. So when I'm, again, focused on something like HIV, I should start global, right? This is a really big problem globally. And then the next paragraph, usually our introduction, we try to think about being, say, 4 to 5 paragraphs long. When you think about most journals, say on average for scientific papers around 3,000 words, some are so generous they give you 5,000 words to work with, some are so stingy they give you like 1,500 to work with, right? But 3,000 is kind of an average. So we're gonna get to the point. We're not gonna use a lot of words, again, elaborating on something that's really not that important. So the second paragraph, we want to be more specific to our purpose statement. So we might want to talk about the magnitude of the problem within our setting. So globally, 37 million people are infected with HIV. Locally in Clark County, then I might talk about, who is most likely to be impacted, where the majority of new HIV infections are occurring. The next paragraph, again, we're funneling down more specific to our purpose. So what do we know about this topic? So what do we know about, HIV transmission in Clark County? If my study is going to look at HIV in Clark County. The next paragraph, more specific to the purpose. Okay, here's the gap in knowledge. Like, we know all of this stuff, but here's where we don't have information. And hey, my study is going to fill this gap in knowledge, and that's going to be my purpose statement. So we're guiding the reader. I like to tell my students, when you're thinking about writing your introduction, think about taking the reader on what, like taking their hand, hey, let's go on a walk. I'm going to show you like why my study is so important, right? And so I'm going to stay focused on that and make sure that I'm funneling down to my purpose statement. So some good rules for writing an introduction. We want to present the nature and scope of the problem clearly. We're always going to orient the reader right to the literature. This isn't a dissertation or thesis amount of orientation, but the most relevant current, like what do we know? What's the state of the field, right? We're going to orient the reader to that. Tell them what we know, and again, tell them what we don't know. What are the gaps of knowledge that our research is going to fill? We state our objective or our purpose. In some fields, not so common in the health science fields, we might at least allude to our methods. Like, again, there's a huge national data set that's conducted by the CDC. It's the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. 500,000 adults in the US participate in this survey. So I might allude to, like, we're going to be using the BRFSS, so we know this is like a cross-sectional study, but we don't go really a lot into the methods. And then talking about the results and the conclusions, we never do that in health sciences. Now, I don't know, in some of your other fields, maybe you do tell the reader what the results and the conclusions are in the introduction. I'm not familiar with that because we don't do it in health sciences. We make our readers get down to the results to find out, right? We don't pre-tell them what the results are going to be. They have to hold on. So whenever you're thinking about your purpose statement or the goal of your research, so what is it? What are you attempting to do with your research? Again, are you filling a gap in knowledge? Are you testing and comparing procedures? So maybe, there are 2 different ways of staining and using fluoroscopy on microorganisms, and you're going to say what compare and contrast those 2 different methods of that. Maybe you developed a brand new method. Maybe you've developed a brand new statistical method for analyzing data, and so you're going to be providing that knowledge. Maybe you're doing a systematic literature review, so you're providing the reader like, okay, this is everything that we know about this topic, and we did this in a systematic review. Or maybe you're testing a hypothesis or answering a research question, which I think that's probably the majority of the time what we're doing, what the purpose of our study is. Your introduction can be divided into subsections, and it can be divided into subsections with headings. Sometimes when you're writing, again, when we think about just good writing in general, right, we want to go from one paragraph to the next paragraph, we want to have a smooth transition. So usually either the last paragraph of the previous sentence of the previous paragraph tells you what you're going to be talking about in the next paragraph, or the first sentence of the paragraph reflects back to that last paragraph. So we have those ways of linking paragraphs together, but sometimes it's just like, oh, I can't. And I'm like, link these two things together. We'll use subheadings. Okay, maybe I'm talking about health disparities, and then I'm talking about, I don't know, physical activity. I just can't figure out how to link those things and use subheadings, and that's perfectly fine. And then we end our conclusion with our purpose statement. The purpose of this study is to X, Y, Z, which then leads us right into our method section. So, okay, now I'm going to tell you about how we did X, Y, and Z. So our materials and methods section, is going to be a complete description of all the methods that we use. Okay, so we're going to be, I like to, again, when I'm thinking about the methods, think about if you're writing a recipe for somebody, right? You do it in a chronological order. Okay, first you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And so if I give that recipe to someone else, they could follow and duplicate exactly what I did. So if I baked a cake and I wrote down everything I did and I gave it to them, they should be able to bake the same cake, right? We want, if someone else picks up our article and they want to duplicate our study, they need to be able to go through our study and boop, 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 step by step, and be able to duplicate our study exactly. So, or replicate our study. So the methods are always written in the past tense. Even if you just finished analyzing your data, that's happened, right? So we always write our methods in the past tense. And again, we want to think about chronological order, how do we do things, and be very clear and specific so that our reader can duplicate those methods. Our methods are generally separated into subsections. And so, if it makes sense for your paper, you might want to think about subsections with subsection headings being like, what was your experimental design? So did you do a cohort study over a period of time? Did you do a randomized controlled trial? What sort of experimental design did you use? We want to talk about the setting and the time period when we did our study. What was the population, or what was the sample that we conducted our study on? What instruments did we use? How did we do data collection? Or what were our data sources? So maybe we went out and collected some microorganisms at Lake Mead, or maybe we used a secondary data set. So, but we need to be very clear about that. What were our variables? So what were our dependent variables and what were our independent variables? And then we typically conclude the method section with the data analysis section. So when we're talking about the data, the setting of the data collection part, so where were our data collected, or where was our study conducted? And we want to be specific about it, right? So if we, again, I'm going to use Lake Mead for example a lot today. So if we go out to make Lake Mead and we collect samples, maybe we collect samples at 5 different locations on Lake Mead. We want to be specific about that, right? So we might want to include a map, and it is perfectly fine in your methods section to include a map, to include a table, to include a floor plan, whatever kind of graphics you need to use to be specific. So if we did sampling at 5 different sites at Lake Mead, a map with the sites where we collected our data. So in 5 years from now, someone's like, you know what, I want to see if it's better, if E. coli contamination of Lake Mead is better 5 years from now. They could go out to those sites and collect that data because they know exactly where you collected it from. Or it could be that you collected your data from across the United States. It could be that you collected your data from across the globe, right? But we want to be clear about that. When were our data collected? So did we collect them over a course of a week? Did we do prospective study, and so then we collected over courses of years? Did we go at certain days and times? So again, if like we're going out to Lake Mead, maybe we want to go sample for E. coli at certain days during the summer and the morning time. Okay, well, we want to be clear about that again, so that someone wants to go replicate that 5 years from now, they're not going out and sampling in the winter and saying, oh, well, E. coli contamination is so much less than it was 5 years previously. It's like, well, maybe it's just because you sampled it at a completely different time when people aren't out recreating on Lake Mead so much, right? So how did we collect our data? And again, this is the part where details. So if we're doing stuff where we use a lot of instruments or equipment, we want to be sure to say what is the name of each of those pieces, those instruments that we use. Who's the manufacturer? So if we're doing I don't know, PCR, there might be 3 or 4 different companies who make PCR equipment. So we want to say what was the manufacturer of that equipment. If we're using a validated survey, so we have tons of validated surveys, especially in the health sciences, that we utilize. So if it was validated, who developed the survey, who validated it, what were the information about the validation, so that again the reader can say, oh yeah, that's a really valid instrument, or that's a lukewarmly valid instrument. So give them the ability to make those decisions on their own. If you developed your own survey, talk about how you developed your survey, if you pilot tested your survey, if you send it out to a group of experts to at least have sort of content validity. If you did a validation of your survey, provide that information for your reader as well, so that they have a really good understanding of how you developed your survey and how you at least tested it to ensure that what you're asking is what the participants were reading and they got that information. So in the methods section, if it's applicable, you want to talk about how you clean the instrument. So did you clean your instruments between sampling sites? Did you clean it between samples? Some things that we do with microorganisms, we might need to clean our instruments every single time we collect a sample. If it's applicable, if you calibrate your instruments, you want to talk about that. So maybe you calibrated your instruments at the beginning of each day. Maybe you calibrated them at the very beginning of the study. You calibrated them between every single sample, whatever that is. Again, details so that people can replicate your study. I'm just gonna say, if you have any questions, please just stop me, because I'm really bad about just getting on a flow and not stopping to ask if you have questions. But if you do, just stop me and let's talk about it, right on the spot, rather than waiting to the end. So at this point, does anyone have any questions? So then usually the next logical thing that we talk about is, how did we analyze our samples? So again, if we're getting some cultures from meat and growing them in an incubator and then taking them and putting them under a microscope, how did we do all this processing to be able to analyze our samples? Again, give details about the procedures that you used. And then usually our method section concludes with our statistical analysis. So we always want to provide information about what software did we use to analyze our data. Did we use R or SAS or SPSS or Excel, or whatever that is that we use. We usually want to give the software and then the issue number. So if you're using SAS, it would be SAS 9.5, I think it's the most current, or SPSS 25 is the most current. So give that information, so just so that the reader knows exactly what you did. You want to identify what are your dependent variables and what are your independent variables. And it's even good to talk about, so, if your dependent variable is continuous, so you did, multiple logistic regression because we had a continuous dependent variable, again, let the reader know, okay, you really understand what you did. You really understand the methods that you use behind your statistical analysis. And then you're going to describe all the different statistics that you use. So typipally we start out with maybe doing, especially when we're doing people research, with some descriptive characteristics of the sample, right? And we might do some chi-square to see if there are significant differences between our groups of our sample. And then, then what do we move on to? Maybe you do univariate analysis, and then maybe we do multivariate analysis. So just, again, walk the reader through. How did you go through this process of analyzing your data? So a well-written method section is critical. If you don't have a well-written method section and you have a reviewer reading your paper and it calls in the question and I'm really not sure I understand why they use, multiple linear regression here, I'm not seeing it, then it just kind of puts that doubt in their mind about the whole process, right? So if I'm not sure about how they analyze their data, then am I really sure about how they collected their data and all that sort of stuff? So don't leave any room for question or for doubt for the reviewer to come in and have a reason to say, let's reject this manuscript, right? So after the materials and methods section, then we have our results section. So our introduction to methods tell our readers why we did the study and how we did the study, right? Our discussion tells the reader what our results mean. So that's when we do the interpretation of our results. But our results section is simply that. We are just telling them the findings of our study. We're not interpreting them. We're not comparing them to anything else. We're just saying, this is what we found in our study. Usually it's the most important part of your paper, right? That's what people are looking for. They want to know what you found in your study. So it's important, again, that we're very, very clear and precise whenever we're writing our results section. So also the results section is written in the past tense. We want to present representative and relevant data. We don't want to just have this endless string of information and results in our results section. So I love this quote: "The compulsion to include everything, leaving nothing out, does not prove that one has unlimited information. It proves that one lacks discrimination or the ability to discern what is important and what is not important," right? So we need to be discerning and discriminating in what we report in our results section. So whenever a person looks at our results section, we don't want them to have the spinny eyes going like, oh my gosh, there's so many words in this results section. I don't even want to read this. No, we want them to have the eyes, right? So in our results section, we want to think about, we're going to have some text, and then we're going to refer the reader to a table. We have some text, and we're going to refer the reader to the graph. Within the text part, we're summarizing what's in our table or what's in our graph. We're not saying everything that's in our table or everything that's in our graph, right? We're saying X, Y, and Z were significant. Go look at this beautiful table that I spent so much time creating. I want you to go look at that, right? So we're going to be directing our readers over to our tables and to our graphics. So if the results that we're providing are just a few, so if you're thinking about, okay, if I turn this into a table, would I have fewer than 2 rows or fewer than 2 columns in this table? If that is the case, then you probably don't need a table to present those results. You can just write it out. So again, like just a univariate regression model, right? It's pretty simple, not a lot of statistics. So maybe we just write that out in 1 sentence. But if we're going to be providing a lot of results, then we want to think about maybe putting those in a table or some sort of graph. And again, talk about, okay, here are the significant findings. Hey, go look at this cool table that I made, right? And you'll be able to see like details about these findings. We only want to include meaningful statistics. So in this case, 33.3% of the mice were cured by the test drug, 33.3% of the mice were unaffected, and the third mouse got away, right? Like, okay, that doesn't mean anything, right? That doesn't tell you whether the drug was effective or not. So just don't even include something like that. When we're thinking about our results section, it needs to be short and sweet without, again, too much verbiage, without trying to explain our findings. Most of the time, if you're thinking about, you know, your manuscript and you look at your results section, typically that's the shortest section, and it can be the shortest section if it is preceded by a really good method section, right? So you really clearly describe your study and how you conducted your study. Then you have your results, and then it's followed by a really good discussion section that again talks about the findings from your study. Crystal clear, simply stated. Again, don't have the reader guess like, what, you know, was that result significant or not? Like, I really can't tell from what they wrote or the way they wrote it. No, be crystal clear about that. A lot of times your paper will stand on or fall based on your results, so don't leave room for confusion when people are reading it, especially when reviewers are reading it. So when you're thinking about the results section, you want to make sure that you're avoiding redundancy. So we don't necessarily want to put into words exactly what's in the table. We certainly, the worst thing is to put everything into words that is in a table. I had a master's student who did not take my technical writing class, even though it's required for our master's. So I'm not sure how she like got through that, right? But so she sent me the first draft of her final manuscript. And the results section, she had tons and tons of variables. So she had probably 5 tables with each table had 20 variables on it. And she had written out every single finding from every single table. And I wanted to cry for her because there hours, if not days, if not weeks of her life, goodbye, just went into writing all of that when it wasn't necessary, right? I never make that mistake again with my students, right? So we want to make sure we do not put everything in the words that we have in our table. summarize it, and then send the reader over to the table. We do want to make sure that we state, again, the most important findings, like, right, what were your significant findings? Or if you hypothesize something based on previous research, right, and then your findings are completely the opposite of that, maybe you hypothesized something was going to be significant and it wasn't significant. Well, even though that's not a significant finding, it's an important finding, right? So we want to talk about, make sure to include that in our results section again. Then we send the reader over to the table. We want to make sure that we're not too verbose, so not too wordy, long-winded, pompous, or pretentious. So an example would be, so if we're writing a results section and you say something like, it is clearly shown in table 1. Like you can almost see the person like shaking their, like, it is clear. I mean, hello, right? Now, don't need that. We don't need those words, especially when words are precious and we sometimes are scrambling to cut things, right? Just start out, statement of the facts, right? Knowledge of the ADA with the particular barriers. We don't have to say anything about it clearly being shown in our table. So the results section, again, is we are only presenting our results. We are not interpreting our results. We save that for the discussion section. And we want to have some logical order of how we're presenting our results, right? And it's, again, perfectly fine to use subheadings whenever we're presenting our results. Like maybe, the first subheading might be the descriptive characteristics of the sample, and then get into our, first our univariate analysis and then our multivariable analysis, something like that. A lot of times if we think about, well, how did we write our method section, right? So first we tell the reader, first we did descriptive characteristics of the sample, then we did this analysis and we did this analysis. So our subsections in our results section could follow exactly what we told them we were doing in our methods. So in this paper, first we said, okay, the descriptive statistics are computed. So the very first subheading under methods is the descriptive characteristics of the administrators, right? And then the next part was the qualitative analysis. So the next section is the qualitative results. And then the next thing that we did in our methods was the chi-square analysis to look at different accommodations. So the third subsection is accommodations for people, right? So just follow exactly what you did in your methods again. So it just, the reader can go, okay, this is what you did for your analysis, and here are your results. Wow, that is clear and that makes sense. Again, when we have our tables and graphics in our manuscript, we want to make sure that we lead or refer the reader to those tables and graphics. We would never just plop a table in our manuscript and never talk about it, right? Because then the reader's going, okay, why is table 1 here? Why is this included? No, we want to talk about, okay, the summary of the descriptive characteristics can be found in table 1. Here are some highlights, right? That sort of thing. We want to, again, refer and let our reader know, what are they looking for? What should they be aware of whenever they're looking at your tables or your graphs? Typically, we want to, and a lot of times, again, we don't have control over this. We want to look at the author guidelines for the journal. Sometimes they want us to put our tables or graphs in the manuscript. Often they don't. So I usually will put sort of in brackets like, insert table 1 here, please. And then, because usually they want them at the end of the manuscript, or they want them uploaded in a separate document, or they want each table uploaded as a separate document. So we have to refer to the author guidelines. But that's sort of what we're thinking about, like, okay, I'm going to talk about table 1, and then I'd like to ask the editor to please put table 1 here, right after I've talked about it. In the text of our results, again, we don't want to give too much detail, so we wouldn't want to list everything that's in the table. So in this example, we're talking about, well, what were the high temperatures on the days that we went out and collected samples? So instead of giving the whole list of temperatures, maybe instead it would be better to say the average temperature during data collection was this. But then if you want all the different temperatures, go look at table 1. Or maybe we say what the range was. So the low was this and the high was this. But if you want all of the, like, hey, then go look at that table, right? But we don't have to give all of those, that whole range of numbers in our words. We also want to avoid excessively long or complicated presentation of data. So in this case, the concentrations of fungal spores before, during, and after human activity change from all these numbers, right? And that sort of stuff. Well, maybe again, we're going to have a table with all this information. So maybe better just to summarize this. So the highest concentration of fungal spores were measured after human activity. Go look at the table for the rest of the information, what it was before, during, and after. Any questions about results? If someone here has a question, would I see that or? All right, let's talk about the discussion. How many of you, this is the hardest thing to write? It is for me. I struggle. I kind of get a little sweaty when I have to sit down and write discussion. I think because, like you think about when you're going through school, we write introductions all the time, research papers, what do we know about this topic, that sort of thing. Hopefully, if you've had a good research methods class, you learned to write a methods section. If you've had some good statistics classes, you've learned how to write results sections. Hardly ever practice or get a lot of instruction about how to write a discussion section. It's typically the hardest to define. It's easy to tell you how to write a method section, like exactly what you did. It's easy to tell you how to write a results section. It's kind of a little bit more difficult to describe how to write a discussion section. A lot of time our discussion sections rush, like, okay, I've done all of this, work, and I've analyzed all this data, I've written all this up, and so I have to hurry up and write my discussion in the next few days so I can get this paper submitted because I'm on some sort of a timeline, or maybe you have some goals that you're trying to reach. A lot of times, especially people who are first starting to write scientific writing will simply restate what their results were, like, okay, these things are significant, and then okay, these things are significant, right? And that's not what we want to do. We're not just repeating our results section. And a lot of times, discussion sections tend to be too long and too verbose. So in our discussion section, what we're looking to do is present generalizations, talk about relationships. So we found this great linear relationship between the amount of time people spend exercising and their bone density. We'll talk about that relationship, right? We want to also compare and contrast what we found to what other people have found. We want to point out any exceptions or lack of correlation. So, for example, I don't know of a research study that's looked at smoking and lung health and hasn't found a relationship between smoking and poor lung health, right? But maybe I'm going to do a study looking at e-cigarettes. And I would hypothesize that e-cigarettes would have that same relationship between lung health. But what if I didn't find any relationship? That would be unexpected, right? That would be like, oh my goodness, I would never have hypothesized. So we want to talk about that. Why do we think we're finding this different relationship than what's been found in the past, or what we hypothesize that we would find? We want to talk about any theoretical implications or application of our work. Okay, so maybe we did some great health promotion intervention and we found out that our program to increase HIV testing among adolescents was just like, man, it was great. We went from like 20% testing to 95% testing. So, okay, how can our program that we created be applied to other settings or maybe other groups of people, right? And we'll talk about that. We want to clearly state our conclusions, and we want to point out the advantages or the limitations of our study. So how was our study better than studies that have been done in the past? And again, we want to be clear about what the limitations of our study, what the limitations are, because every single study has some limitations. Okay, no study is perfect. So we talked about the introduction and the discussion. They should work in pair. So the introduction, we're posing one or more questions. We have our research questions, right? And then our discussion, we're answering those questions. Okay, so we want to think about how those work together. Again, the introduction, we start broad and we narrow down to the purpose of our study. Our discussion, we start specific. So what are the most important findings? And then we fan out to the broader. So what are the implications of the findings from our study? So when you're writing your discussions section, there are two different ways to start off the discussion section. So the first way, you can sort of reorient the reader to the purpose of your study. So kind of have a few sentences about remember now the purpose of the study and what our research questions were. Or you can just start out by saying the most important finding or the most interesting finding from this study was X. And I feel like I've been successful having things published both ways, but I think from a reviewer perspective and an editor perspective, if you just start out, okay, the most interesting finding from this study is X. Again, they're not having to guess about what the most important or interesting finding was. You tell them right away as you start your discussion. I want to discuss again how your findings relate to previous research. So are you supporting what other researchers have found? So maybe they did a program to increase HIV testing among adolescents in Nigeria, and we're finding that among adolescents in Clark County, we're finding the exact same thing. If we reduce stigma and some of the barriers to finding testing sites, we see an increase in testing. So whether in Nigeria or here, we're finding those same findings. So how do these relate to previous findings? Again, we want to note that implications are the applications of our findings. So what are our findings mean, right? And I think, again, this is sometimes where people struggle, like to say, okay, this is what I found, but what does it mean? What do your findings mean? And then identify those unanswered questions for the next research. So as researchers, we often will maybe come up with an idea for research by reading literature in our field, right? And at the end of those papers, usually people will say, the next research should focus on this. Like we took the ball this far, but the next researcher should pick up the ball from here and take it the next 10 yards down the field, right? Well, so you took it the next 10 yards, so tell the next group of people, okay, this is what the next researcher should be looking at. Here are the next questions that we should be answering in this line of research. So identify those unanswered questions or where the next research should be going. In our discussion, we want to, again, talk about the strengths and limitations of our study. So don't be shy about the strengths of your study, right? If you did something that was really novel and unique and has never been done before, tell people about it, right? Maybe you had a better experimental technique. Maybe you have a really big sample size. Maybe other previous research only, worked with hundreds of people and your study had thousands of people, right? Talk about that. Maybe you did a longer follow-up. Maybe previous research only followed people for 3 months and said, oh yeah, our program worked, and you followed them for a year and still showed that the program worked. Talk about those. But also be honest about your limitations. You don't want to get a review back where you didn't really point out the limitations, but the reviewer points out all the limitations and then tells the editor that's the reason why they should reject your manuscript, because you didn't know. It shows that you didn't know what your limitations were, right? You need to know what your limitations are and then be honest about those limitations. And again, I usually start my limitations just like any other study. This study has limitations, right? I mean, hey, we all have limitations, but be honest about those. We want to tell the reader the significance of our findings, again, when we are thinking about our conclusion paragraph. So again, we've done all of this and we're going to boil it down to this one last conclusion paragraph. So the so what of my paper. So what? So what does this mean? What do your findings mean? What did your study mean? We want to try to end with a bang rather than a whimper, right? I mean, some people are kind of, you can almost feel them losing their energy as they get to the conclusion paragraph, right? When you're reviewing papers, it's like, oh, they just ran out of steam. So we want to maybe say that for a fresh day, write that one last paragraph. And again, really drive home so what of your paper. But we don't want to overreach our conclusions, right? Like maybe our little program we did here in Clark County increased HIV testing among adolescents. In our conclusion, we wouldn't say if everyone implemented this program, there would be 100% HIV testing among adolescents. We don't know that, right? We can't say that. So that would be overreaching our conclusions. Our conclusions need to be supported by the data that's in our manuscript. So our conclusion, typically we're not going to reach some cosmic conclusion, right? It's unlikely that we're going to illuminate the whole truth of some research question, right? But maybe instead we're just going to shine a spotlight on one area again, and then other researchers are going to shine spotlights on other areas, and together as a research community, then we'll illuminate the whole truth about this research topic. And then again, we also want to make those recommendations for future research. All right, so that's sort of the anatomy of a manuscript and how all of these pieces and parts work together. I can tell that this semester, so in spring semester, I teach scientific writing, and my papers are always better in the spring semester when I'm teaching, when it's top of mind, right? When I'm really being thoughtful about everything that I'm writing, making sure that my introductions and discussions go together. When you're thinking about your discussion, you don't want to start talking about anything in your discussion that you haven't at least mention in the introduction. Maybe you're not going to go into super big detail in the introduction, but you want to at least mention it so that the reader, when they get to the discussion, is just like, where did this come from? Like, okay, you haven't been talking about this at all. Nothing about this in the introduction, then bam, you give me this information in the discussion. That's why sometimes it's good to write your introduction and your discussion together after you know what your results are. So that if you're gonna, like, you find this result and you know you want to talk about this in your discussion, you can at least mention it in your introduction. So again, it's not out of the blue. Yeah.
I have a question from one of our participants.
Okay.
She has questions about the relationship that Pharr slide. Could those relationships be directly related to results, or
so there are two different relationships you might want to talk about in your discussion. So relationships might be between variables that are from your results section. So again, we found that as this independent variable increased, our dependent variable increased or decreased. So those relationships, okay, talk about that. But then you also will talk about your findings in relation to what other people have found, right? So maybe we put, people on like some sort of a supplement to try to increase bone density. And we saw that with our exercise program and this supplement, bone density went really high up. And so in relation to other studies where maybe they only did the supplement or they only did exercise, we saw this difference with our program. But we're going to talk about both of those, both the relationships between our variables and then between our study and other studies. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
One or the new things that can offer
So I mean, certainly. So if you found something that hasn't been discussed in literature before, that would definitely be an advantage. So like no one has ever studied this before. That's an advantage of your study. But also the advantage is, so when you think about the strengths of your study, so maybe no one has ever analyzed or looked at this topic in the way that you're looking at it, right? So there are a lot of examples. So maybe someone did a systematic review of the literature, a decade ago. And so now you're looking at the findings from this decade. Well, that's an advantage because we have the most current information in your study versus the previous study. So those sort of advantages. Yeah, great question. Any other questions?
Another question.
Yeah.
People can use a lot of information. A lot of the times in articles, when they talk about so, but it's really more about what is defined.
Right. What do you mean? Yeah. Yeah. And that's, again, I think it's hard for a lot of people to write discussion sections, right? And so, I find like with my doc students, I really have to push them to write, what do your findings mean? I know what your findings are, but what do your findings mean, right? And that's, again, something you have to sit with, you have to think about, you have to look at what previous research has found and really come up with what are the implications for your findings. And they're not what future research should be doing, right? Right.
Unless,
the journal requires it. Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen a lot of, I've seen it go a lot of different ways. Like some people will, after the limitations, write a conclusion and label it conclusion. And some people are just like, okay, I've written all this in the discussion. The reader should be able to know what the conclusions are, right? Some journals require that you put implications for practice like that. If you don't have it, it's not going to get reviewed, right? And other journals don't. So it's kind of like, what do you have space for and what are the requirements of the journal? A lot of times we have to go to those author guidelines and be really familiar. If possible, so if you know that you're going to be targeting certain journals with your work, better just to, look at the author guidelines and go ahead and set up your manuscript to be consistent with those guidelines. There's nothing, well, there are things more painful, but there is something very painful about writing a 5,000 word paper and then having to cut 2,000 words of it. Of your precious, precious writing, right? That's hard. So if you know that, hey, I'm going to be targeting this journal and the word limit's 3,000, I'm going to stick at 3,000, right? I'm not going to go over that. And then if I have to revise and resubmit it someplace else, that's fine. But I'm targeting this journal, so go ahead and set it up that way. I don't work for RefWorks, but RefWorks is free through UNLV Library. Whatever sort of citation tool you're going to choose to use, I recommend that you choose to use one, Mendeley or EndNote or whatever that is, right? But it will save you so much time if you can do like the write and cite. So as you're writing, drop in your citations, and then, okay, the first journal I'm submitting it to is American Medical Association citation style. So click, and it puts everything into AMA, and then darn it, it got rejected from that. So I'm going to submit it someplace else. And yep, they're APA. So click, everything's an APA. Not doing that manually. Again, days of your life will be goodbye because you spent time reading it. All right, let's talk about writing a good title. This is something that I honestly, I don't know, I'm just sort of like, okay, whatever, you know, by the time I finish writing manuscript, like whatever the title is, well, put something on there, get it submitted. But it's really important that we write a good title, right? So titles need to be as few words as possible that reflect the content of our paper. So we want them to be concise, not too long, not too short, and a good number of words for a title is between 12 and 13. Okay, that's sort of what we're shooting for. Sometimes journals will tell you how long your title can be, how many characters or how many words your title can be. So of course you want to stick within that, whatever they tell you. But you know, if we're sort of shooting for that 12 or 13 words, that kind of puts our mindset that if we write a title that's 28 words, probably a lot of things that we can cut out of that title, make it more concise. Our title is going to be read, we hope our title will be read by thousands of people, right? Our abstract might be read by hundreds of people, and our paper might be read by tens of people, like, you know, but people are going to see your title when they're going into databases and searching for, you know, information research in your field of study. Your title is going to pop up if it's been written correctly so that it's being indexed correctly. Don't need to be clever or provocative with our titles. We just need to be clear about them. So titles are used for indexing. So like Medline or Scopus, whatever, they'll take the words from your title, and then whenever someone goes in and types those words in, then your title's going to pop. So again, you want to think about what words are going to highlight the purpose or the significance of my paper. I want to make sure that I try to include those into my title. We want to be specific. So rather than writing a title that's like the action, we would prefer to write a title that would say the action of streptomycin on microbacteria and tuberculosis rather than the action of antibiotics on bacteria. We wrote that title, the action of what antibiotic on what bacteria, right? So if someone's looking for tuberculosis, our paper may never pop, or someone's looking at streptomycin, our paper may never pop, right? So we want to make sure that we use words that are specific to the purpose and the content of our paper. We want to avoid jargon. Typically, we don't use abbreviations in title unless it's a really, really well-known abbreviation, right? So if I put HIV in the title, people don't know what HIV is, right? Then they were living on Mars or something like that, right? But typically, we don't use abbreviations in our title. If possible, if we can fit it in, we want to talk about what our study design was. So say if we did a systematic review or mixed methods or a randomized controlled trial or something like that, we want to put that in the title. So examples of two different titles. The first example, way too many words. I get about halfway through and I lose focus, take a little nap, something like that. The bottom title, way too general and short, right? Pandemic influenza among pregnant women. What? Like died or globally or historically or what? I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. So there are some steps to writing a really good title. And I found this a couple of years ago and had certainly implemented it whenever I'm working on my papers and trying to come up with a really, really good title. So there are 4 different steps that we can follow to make sure that we're writing a good title. So first we answer these questions. What is my paper about? What technique or design did I use? Who or what did I study? And what were my results? So first step number 1 is we write just a short answer to these 4 different questions. So my paper studied whether X therapy improved cognitive functions of patients suffering from dementia. That's what my study was about. It was a randomized trial. I studied 40 cases from 6 cities in Japan. And I found that X therapy improved cognitive function of the patient. Okay, so those are the answers to the questions. So the next step is I take the answers to those questions and I write keywords. So from those answers, my keywords would be X therapy, randomized trial, dementia, 6 Japanese cities, 40 cases, improved cognitive function. Those are my keywords. Step number 2. Step number 3, we build a sentence with these keywords. So this study was a randomized trial that investigated whether X therapy improved cognitive function in 40 dementia patients from 6 cities in Japan. It reported improved function. So that's 28 words, so about twice as long as we would want our title to be. So the 4th step is then we go in and we delete unnecessary words. So we don't need in our title a study of, an investigation of. We can take out those words, right? I mean, it's being published. They know that this is a study, right? So we can take out those sort of words. So you go and you just cross out the words. So again, this study investigated whether, we can take all those words out, and then we link all the words that are left together. So randomized trial of X therapy for improving cognitive function in 40 dementia patients from 6 cities in Japan. 18 words, 10 words were gone, way better, but still a little bit too long, right? So then we work with it. We work with our title and try to, again, cut down till we get a really good title. So this title, it could either be a randomized trial of X therapy for improved cognitive function in 40 dementia patients, 13 words, right? Cuts right to the chase of what we're doing. Or if we want to sort of rearrange it and really focus on the results. So X therapy improved cognitive function in 40 dementia patients, colon, a randomized trial, 12 words. Okay, so we're able to get this down again to the true essence of what our paper is. All right, let's talk about writing an abstract. Typically, so usually we write our paper and then we write our title, and the last thing we do is we write our abstract, right? So our abstract is a mini version of what our paper is. So we can oftentimes sort of cut and paste stuff. I usually will go in and cut and paste some things from my manuscript, put it in my abstract, and then start, whittling away and getting rid of some words. So an abstract is an overview or mini version of the paper. We're going to briefly summarize our introduction. Say what our purpose, always our purpose statement, and I will copy and paste that exactly from my paper, not change it, not edit it, because the purpose of my paper is the purpose of my paper is the purpose of my paper. So I leave that sentence as it is. A lot of times, again, when people are searching for manuscripts, they're going to see our title. Oh, that's an interesting title. I'm going to go in and read the abstract. They read the abstract, and from there they determine whether or not they want to pull up our full paper, right? So it's really important, again, that we have a really good abstract that reflects the content of our paper. Usually abstracts are, I'd say on average, about 250 words. I've had them as short as 150. It's hard to write that succinctly, or as generous as 350, right? I could throw words in for fun when you have 350 as the word limit. But again, we're going to be really concise and brief about what we're talking about. Usually abstracts, there are 2 ways that abstracts are written. One is unstructured. So that's without any of those subtitles. So you just write it as one big paragraph. You don't have the introduction methods identified. Or it's a structured abstract. Depends on the journal. They'll tell you what they want. So structured would be you'd have introduction, usually colon, and then your introduction, couple sentences, the methods, couple sentences, results, couple sentences, like that. So the introduction part of your abstract, again, you want to introduce your topic. So have your purpose, your problem statement. So why did you do this research, right? Were previous studies not sufficient? Maybe you want to talk about the health impact. And public health, we always are talking about the health impacts. How many people were impacted by this, or something bad happened, how many people would be impacted by this, right? What's the magnitude of the problem? So again, we want to kind of, hey, people, this is really important study, and then this is the purpose of my study. So an example, this is from one of my papers. So globally, 37 million people are infected with HIV, with adolescents making up the largest % of new infections. So I'm probably going to be talking about HIV and adolescents, something about that, right? However, this group is the least likely to be tested for HIV and linked to care for treatment and prevention. I'm probably going to be talking about HIV testing among adolescents because these are the things I'm highlighting, those first two sentences, right? The purpose of the study was to examine barriers to HIV testing experienced by adolescents. 53 words. So if I'm thinking about a structured abstract, you know, if I had 50, 50, 50, 50, that'd be about 200 word abstract. So 2 sort of introduction sentences to say, hey, this is why this is so important, and then this is the purpose of my study. The methods section. So again, we're being very brief here. We want to briefly describe the study design, the sampling or data collection methods, the sampling or data collection sites, when our data were collected, how our samples were analyzed, or how we did our statistical analysis. We want to talk about the major aspects of the methods without getting too in the weeds and too in the details, right? So here we're not going to list our equipment and be so detailed as we are in the methods of our paper. So an example, and we can bunch this stuff together, right? We don't need one sentence for each of those different bullets. So an example would be, this was a cross-sectional, so we talked about our study design, examination of data collected through the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System survey. So we did a survey, is how we collected our data among adults in the United States. So we need geographically, and we know where this is, between January 1st and December 31st, 2016. So I include in that one sentence, we had a lot of those different things that we need to include in our methods, right? Our design, who we did the study on, when we did it, where we did it, how we did it, right? So we included all of this. And then a second sentence, descriptive statistics, odds ratios, and adjusted odds ratios were calculated. Boom, 39 words. We covered all that we needed to cover for the method section. For the results section, again, we want to present our major findings. So what were our statistically significant findings, or the things that we thought we'd find that we didn't, right? Even if like, oh, we really thought this was going to be significant and it wasn't. So what were either our significant findings or our important findings? And then we want to conclude the abstract with just a summary of the major importance of our results. So again, that's sort of what are the implications of our study in 1 or 2 sentences in the abstract. So in the abstract, we want to avoid giving too much detail about our instruments unless, you know, like we need to be really specific. Maybe we use a brand new sort of PCR or qPCR machine. I'm not an infectious disease person, but they throw these things around all the time. Like, you know, maybe we did something that has never been done before with some sort of instruments. We want to talk about that. We don't want to include a lot of details about our data collection. We don't want to be like too in the weeds again about the methods. Typically, we don't use acronyms unless we're going to be repeating something several times within the abstract. So, and of course, we're short on words. So I did a study with traditional birth attendants in Nigeria. And so I probably used traditional birth attendants like 6 times in the abstract. That's a lot of words, you know, in a precious 250 word abstract. So in that case, you could use an acronym, right? Because you're going to be repeating yourself a lot in the abstract. And most importantly, we don't want to include anything in our abstract that we do not include in the paper, right? Only things from our paper go in our abstract. We don't say something abstract and then people are reading our paper like, you never, but what, I can't find that. That never is in the paper, right? We don't want them to be there. All right, either I can stop there and open up for questions, or I have a few slides about using graphics in your paper. So if you would like to see that information, like about tables and figures and graphs, so mine go on like maybe 7 minutes more, and then we'll call it. Okay, so some of the advantages of using graphics in our papers. So we probably have all heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We can communicate a lot of information through a table or through a graphic, right, in our paper without having to, again, write out all of those words. Sometimes it's easier to present table data in a table than writing it out, right? It's just, okay, here are my beta coefficients, here are my p-values, here are my 90, you know, just like, here it is in the table, much easier than trying to write that out. Both figures and tables attract the attention of the readers. I know a lot of times when I'm looking at a manuscript, I'm like, okay, yes, this is what I want to know. I will go right to the tables and see, okay, what are the significant findings? What are the significant variables of this paper, right? And they're easier, they're sometimes aesthetically more pleasing, right? They're easier to look at than just a whole bunch of text. We can use graphics to enforce emphasis. A lot of times they require less space. Again, putting something on the table rather than writing all that out in words takes less space. And they're critical for numerical and statistical information. So when you're thinking about a table versus a figure, so tables are really good if we're listing numbers or text that could fall really well into labeled columns. Okay, so if we have a bunch of variables again and we want to list beta coefficients and values and p-values and 95% confidence intervals, great to put into a table. Tables do not show trends or relationships. So if we're trying to show trends or relationships with our data, it's going to be better for us to use some other graphic. So maybe a bar graph or a line graph, something like that. Whenever we're writing tables, the legend goes above the body of the table. Whenever we're doing figures, the legend goes below the figure. So figures are great for for visual presentation of the data. They're really good for showing trends and relationships. They're not good if you want people to know exact numbers. So if I want you to know that this number was 10.5, showing you that on a bar graph, you're not gonna, you might say, oh, is it 10.7 or 1, or like it's hard to see that, right? If I need you to have exact numbers, then I'm wanting to table inside. Whenever we're thinking about our tables and figures, so between, like in this line graph, between our X and Y axis and how we've labeled those and our figure, legend or title, if I were walking across campus and this table blew out and blew down the walkway and someone picked it up, they should be able to look at it and say, oh, I know exactly what this is about, right? So this, we're looking at bone density by minutes of exercise per week in middle-aged women. So on the x-axis, we have minutes of exercise, and we have the number of minutes that they're exercising. We have bone density in meters squared, and we have this beautiful, nice relationship, right? So everything is clearly labeled. A lot of times, maybe we forget, like we're so into this, like we know exactly what these numbers mean over here, like, you know, and we don't tell people what those numbers mean. So if I didn't tell you what those numbers mean, you might look at it and say, well, we're looking at bone density, probably bone density, but is it percent? The number, like I don't really know, right? We don't want to leave room for confusion. So we want to make sure that we clearly label everything. So some of the types of graphics that we have at our disposal that we can use whenever we're thinking about the best way to present our data. We can have a diagram, we can have a flow chart. So maybe a diagram or a flow chart we might want to use in our method section. So maybe we collected samples and part of the samples we did X, Y, and Z with, and the other part we did this with. Maybe a nice flow diagram would be a way to present that. Graphics, so line graphs, bar graphs, those sort of things. Sometimes pictures, right? Sometimes we actually want to show a picture of that little microorganism or whatever it is that we're studying, or tables. Whenever we're trying to figure out what graphic to use, we want to think about what are our data and who is our audience? What's going to be the best way to present this data? What are we trying to communicate? So maybe if I'm thinking about, well, I'm going to present my research, I'm going to write a manuscript to publish it, but then I also hope to present it at our national conference maybe before I publish it. So the graphics I use in those two settings might be very different, right? What I put in a paper versus what I use in an oral presentation. So a description of a presentation of a table. So the legend of the table, or how the table is set up. First, we have the title of the table. Then we have, what are our different variables? What do these mean? And then we have the body of the table, and then sometimes we'll have footnotes. So if we have to use a symbol, or maybe we bold something, we talk about, well, what does this symbol mean? What does this acronym or abbreviation mean? What does this bold mean? We put that down at the footnote. But whenever we're developing a table, we want to make sure that the information, that we read the information in the columns going down. Okay, so in this, we're looking at the regions of the world. We're looking at population in millions, so that's a number. We're looking at a birth rate. We're looking at death rate. We're looking at growth rate, and then we're looking at projected populations as a number going down. If we flip this on its side, so flipped it 90 degrees, I guess that would be, and had like, all the different regions of the world, so like the world, Africa, Asia going across, and then we had population in millions, and then birth rate, and then death rate, like going down the column, that would be so confusing, right? So we're gonna have like things going down the rows in the column. That's what we want to think about that. We can use maps if we want to highlight maybe a certain region of the world has the highest burden of a certain disease. So this is looking at deaths from HIV. So in 2013, there were 1,500,000 deaths from HIV, and Africa had 1,100,000 deaths of those deaths. So they have certainly the highest burden of deaths in that region of the world. we want to highlight that, right? Hey, if you want to go try to help people with HIV, Sub-Saharan Africa is where you need to go do your research and those sort of things. So we can use a map again to emphasize, hey, this is really where the highest burden of HIV is. We can use bar graphs again to show trends over time. So this is looking at elevated blood levels of children in the US. So lead was banned from gasoline in 1976. And so we see as, you know, we've banned lead from gasoline and paint and things like that, the amount of lead in children's blood has gone down dramatically. So we can show this trend by using a bar graph. We can also show trends by using line graphs. So here we're looking at meat consumption. So looking at meat consumption over time by millions of metric tons. You can see that, yeah, it's increasing, but it's really increasing in the developing world compared to the developed world. So we can show these trends, both a general trend, but then also trends in two different, you know, parts of the world. We can use, again, to show pictures. Or you can just use sort of other images, again, to really emphasize something. So if I told you, so this is looking at the number of people that one sick person would infect, right? So if I just told you, so if one person has hepatitis C, they're likely to infect 2 people, Ebola 2 people, HIV and SARS 4 people, mumps 10, and measles 18. Okay, that's interesting. But if I show you like these little people, it's like, oh, wow. So if one person has a measles, they can really make a lot of other people sick, right? It's really contagious compared to something like hepatitis C. So again, the anatomy of the table, we have the table legend, then we have the column headings, then we have the body of the table, and then we have the footnotes where we describe any of those symbols or anything that we talk about in the body of the table. The anatomy of a figure, again, the legend goes at the bottom. We want to make sure that we clearly label the x-axis, so the axis along the bottom, our independent variable, and clearly label the y-axis, our dependent variable. And then if we're using, sometimes if we use a line graph, we might use like little symbols. So like this line with the X's on it means this population, and with the squares on it means this population, with the circles means this. We want to make sure that we include a key symbol key, whatever. Tell people what those different symbols mean in the legend. So again, the anatomy of a figure, we have the legend on the bottom, clearly labeled X and Y axis so that people know what we're talking about. So again, like we might want to use this sort of a flow chart. So this is the flow chart illustrating the experimental design. So perfectly great thing to put in our methods. We might want to think about using a pie chart if there are 2 pieces of the pie that are striking or that stand out, right? So this is looking at the world population 1950 compared to what we project in 2050. A lot of it looks the same, right? But there are 2 parts that are really different, right? In 1950, we had Europe representing 21% of the population projected, and 2050, only 7% of the population, where Africa was only 9% of the population, is projected to be 22% of the population. Right? Those 2 things flip. So that's interesting. So we might want to show that as a pie chart. Our bar graphs can go horizontally or vertically. So it's perfectly fine to put them horizontally if that makes sense. They could go below 0 on the x-axis if we need them to. So this is looking at the loss of wetlands in the United States. So we've seen a loss, so we can go below 0. We can use bar graphs to represent lots of different information, right? So here we can see that population growth is growing, because that's just the bars on a graph over time. We can look at more developed countries, so the blue. So that's not where we're seeing big growth in the world population, right? We can look at less developed countries and see, oh, okay, the world population is increasing, and that increase is coming mostly from, almost exclusively from the less developed countries around the world. And we can use three-dimensional bar graphs. So in this, we're looking at waterborne diseases in the United States from 1920 to 2002. And we're looking at years across the x-axis, and then we're looking at numbers of across the y-axis. By making it three-dimensional, we can look at deaths or peak cases are light blue and outbreaks are dark blue. So in 1920 to 1930, a lot of people died from these outbreaks of disease. And then as we get, further along time, we're seeing not as many people are dying. We're still saying like 1971 to 80, there's still a lot of outbreaks, but not as many people are dying from those outbreaks. So it can represent, again, a lot of information. We can use line graphs to represent our data, and we can also include, so this, we can have like linear regressions. We can give information about the linear regression model along with our graph. We can use line graphs to represent a whole bunch of different data. So this is death rates in the US, so from all different kinds of cancers, right? So lung cancer, woo, that's the highest, but then we have prostate cancer, breast cancer, and those sort of things. So we can use symbols on our lines. We can use different color lines. We can use solid line, big dash, big dash, dash, little dash kind of things to represent different elements. We can include multiple pieces of information on a line graph. So this graph, we're looking at use of highly active antiretroviral therapy. That's the dotted line. So over time, we're seeing big increases in this use of antiretroviral, this certain sort of antiretroviral therapy. And then the solid line, we're looking at deaths per 100 person year. So we're seeing that decrease. So as more people are having access to antiretroviral therapy, we see fewer people dying from HIV. So again, give a lot of information on a graph. And we can mix, last slide, we can mix bar graphs and line graphs together. So again, we're looking at world population. So yes, the world population is growing, but then we added the line graph so we can see that most of the world population is growing among urban populations. We're seeing this kind of this decrease in the part of the world population living in rural environments. So we can again add lines to our bars to just convey more information. Wow, that's like three-hour classes all combined into one. All right, any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. So, so for this class, like when we talk about writing a title, would they actually go through the exercise of writing a title in groups, and then we put up the titles and we pick the one that's going to be the best title. And then when we're talking about like writing introduction, I have a couple of examples, one of a well-written introduction, one of a poorly written introduction, just so they could see the difference, right? They, in this past class, and they could really, the well-written example, they're like, I can see the flow, like I can see how this, it comes down to this purpose statement. So we go through that with, the introduction, the methods, the results, and, like look at, okay, this is done well. This is what we're shooting for, and this is done not so well. I also use, and I can send it, then you can send out. It's called Strobe, and for the life of me, I can't tell you what Strobe stands for, but it's some journals, the last paper that I submitted, you actually had to, S-T-R-O-B-E, had to get the document, and mine was a cross-sectional study, and so it tells you, your title and abstract should have this and this in it, and you actually have to say what paragraph or whatever you've addressed these things, and then your introduction should have one or two things in it. Then your methods is where it's really, really heavy. You should have all of these things listed in your methods. And so for the manuscript that I submitted, I had to say the page number and the line number where I addressed, the time period where I collected the data or the design of my study, or whatever. And so by having that document as you're writing, you can be like, I hit all of these things. So there's not one thing that a reviewer can say, I did not include in my paper, right? So it's a really good resource. And so we take that tool and then we look at these manuscripts and say, okay, did they hit all of these things that were required on the Strobe, or what's missing? And how does that affect like your comprehension of the paper? So yeah, we do those sort of activities. Yeah.
What's the advantage and the disadvantage of putting the number of participants? Like the example that you have here. 40 could be a low sample size, and people like, oh,
yeah.
Then we will skip that.
Right. Yeah. I think that's probably atypical unless it's a really under-researched area. Like dementia is so understudied, right? So to show that you had improvements in 40 patients, that would be a big finding. That's a big deal, right? But typically, that's not something that you typically would put in unless it's a big deal. Yeah. there's always that question of, you know, do I put like, if I did in the United States, do I put United States in the title or not? You have a couple of options or a couple of places to like make sure that you're getting your information indexed in the right place. So you have your title, but then you also have to include keywords. So it's like, okay, US is having a hard time getting into my title, so maybe I'm gonna have that as a keyword, right? Instead of putting it into my title. You think about that too. You have multiple different, you know, kind of different places to make sure you're being indexed correctly. Yeah, yeah, so if it's in your, yeah. Yeah, good question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and look at the journal. I can't say I've seen a journal that doesn't require that. And they're all different. So some will want you, you know, after your conclusion, they'll want your acknowledgments and conflict of interest statements using your initials rather than your full name, right? So they can still do blind review. And then the funding, they want all that in the manuscript. Some of them don't want any of that in the manuscript. They want it all on the title page so that it can be, you know, completely blind reviewed. So there's no way that someone can look at your acknowledgments and go, oh, well, they acknowledged a health science librarian from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I wonder if they're from UNLV, you know, I mean, so they want that on the title page. It doesn't go to the reviewers, but I have not seen a journal that does not want a conflict of interest and financial disclosures. Yeah, so those, but just where, go to the author guidelines and see. Yeah. Yeah. That's, so many. Such a good question. Some suggestions. I like to look at who the people I'm referencing, where did they publish? Because the people who are doing research in this field, like if I'm citing them and I'm doing research in this field, then other people doing this research in this field are probably reading those journals. So that's a good place to start. So where are the people that you cited in your paper? Where are they publishing? You can look at impact. It's sometimes you want to say, you know what? Like in public health, Lancet Global is the highest impact journal. So maybe I'm going to go there knowing that, you know, maybe not, but just start high, aim high, right? And then you can go down. I usually like to try to identify 3 or 4 journals that I could submit my paper to and go start the highest. And then if it gets rejected there, then go to the next and go to the next. If it's a well-developed and study and a well-written paper, you're going to find a home for that paper. If it's not a well-developed study, then you know chances are maybe not. But if you've developed your study well and written it well, then you're going to find a home for it. But so I usually start high and then go lower. But you're right; it's hard to decide. You know, it's good to maybe think about things like, you know, do you want to publish in an open access journal where a lot of people are going to be able to see your findings? You know, even if they don't have, you know, university like access to all the journals to the university, you know, kind of pay for articles can get it outside of the university system. So if you want to open access, then you want to consider those. Open access, you want to, you know, sort of look at the reputation of the journal. What are the fees to publish in that open access journal? I've seen as high as $3,000. That's a lot, right, to publish in that sort of journal. Some, if you're doing like NIH research, they require that you publish an open access journal. So part of your funding is to do that. So yeah, I mean, think about those sorts of things, like what's the most prestigious journal in the field, or people doing research. Is there a limit? Is it like $500 limit, or is it not? Is there? Okay. Yeah. Oh, there is a limit. Yeah. Okay. So we've I personally haven't done it, but one of my co-authors has done that through the library, and it's really helpful for some of the open access journals to be able to publish in. I mean, open access. There's the, you know, is it a for-profit journal and they're trying to get money and they don't have high level peer review and those sort of things, or some open access have really high levels of peer review and are really well respected. But some of those publications, for me, those are where I have my most citations, because people out in the field can get that information. So someone out doing HIV prevention in sub-Saharan Africa can actually get my manuscript without having to call a friend who has access to a university to get that, because if it's in a journal, we have to pay per publication. It could be $35, $50 just for that one manuscript, and people love it. So how do you want your information disseminated? It's something that people out in the field.
Then it could be an advantage if your manuscript, if you sign from authors who are from the same journal. The last manuscript I wrote, I said, oh, really? I was looking for the same journal that I was submitting to. Kind of maybe it might give me an advantage, but I don't know.
So to cite authors who publish in the same journal where you're submitting?
Yeah.
It's always, if you can sort of identify like, I wonder where they're going to send my paper for review. You could look at the board, the review board, because those are typically reviewers. And if someone is published on the review board in your area and you don't cite them, I've just certainly gotten it where it's like, you need to cite, Butterfield et al. And it's like, oh, I guess Butterfield probably, was one of the reviewers on my paper. So yeah, you don't want to not cite someone who's significant in the field. So if you look at the editorial board and you're like, oh yeah, that person, they do research in the field. So I want to look to make sure I'm not missing something that they published. That just, you don't ever want to make reviewers mad, right? You always want to, reviewers review out of their own hide, right? You're not getting paid to do it. So you want to make sure that you're getting credit if credit's due.
So thank you all so much for engaging in the discussion, and thank you so much, Dr.
My pleasure.
Pharr.
So here's the is that showing up? Yeah. Here's the paper that the book. It's not expensive or anything like that, but this is the book that's just like so just awesome. It's I think it's GASTL and Robert A. Day.